Ed Bogan, welcome to the State Secrets Podcast.
Hi, thank you, Suzanne. Very, very, very proud to be here.
Very nice to have you here. Very nice to have you as a new Cipher Brief expert as well.
Thank you.
I want to encourage anyone who's listening, if you want to find out more about Ed, which I know you're going to want to do after today's conversation, to Google Cipher Brief and Ed Bogan, Bogan. So welcome. Let's get personal real quick here. I always like to kind of find out, what drives people like you with your incredible background, Ed, to join the CIA. How did you end up there?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I was in law school. I selected a law school that had an international law program because I kind of had this sort of itch. I wanted to see the world. And I chose Temple University in Philadelphia because they had a fairly good international program. And I was able to take my first summer of law school and study abroad. So I went to the University of Athens Law School and took a whole range of international law classes and did some travel, obviously in Greece, and was able to take a trip as well to Egypt when we had sort of a kind of break at the midpoint for about 4 days. And that kind of hit some sort of childhood interests of mine of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and kind of all that stuff. But more importantly, when the course was over, I kind of backpacked from Athens to Belfast, zigzagging across Europe and just sort of experiencing a lot of things for the first time. In terms of international travel. And so I said, okay, I'm setting sort of the hook that I definitely want to have an international career. My second summer of law school, I applied for and was picked for an internship with the State Department. So those are summer long, 10 weeks, free labor, good experience for students, that kind of a thing. And they looked at my background and said, hey, you were in Athens last summer. Would you want to work at the U.S. Embassy in Athens for your internship? And I said, absolutely, because I had friends there. So I went and I worked in the economic section. It was interesting. It was summer of 98. And I got to sort of interact with lots of different agencies and departments and just sort of get very much a 101 of, U.S. government overseas. And while I was there, the Africa Embassy bombings happened. It was probably my second to last week on the job. And we were in the same time zone, basically. So a lot of it was happening during our work day. And, there were people in Athens who knew people there. And there's all kinds of state messages frantically shooting back and forth. And of several, I would say over the course of that summer, I saw messages in state channels about bin Laden in general and about this problem and, lots of discussions with the Saudis about it. And, I also was kind of interested in him. It was noteworthy to me that in '97 he declared war on the United States. So that was one of those things I was like, this is interesting. Who is this?
Did. Yep.
Right. So now this attack happens and I'm finished, and I finish up my internship and I say to myself, I want to join the CIA and go after these guys. And so I finished law school. I started clerking for a judge for a year while I was going through the background investigation process, which is time consuming. It was a good job, and it was a civil court in New Jersey. It wasn't anything international, but it was just more like in line with if I wanted to be a lawyer, this is a really great sort of step one. But I didn't join law school to be a lawyer. I wasn't sort of against it, but I wanted to have kind of a more dynamic graduate degree that could open a lot of doors. Anyway, I was selected and came in right around the same time as my judge was sort of in her last year as a judge, and so she didn't really do the full year. She did about 3/4 of it, and actually worked incredibly well. Her retirement and my offer all kind of matched up. So I moved to D.C. from Philadelphia and got started.
To go to work for the CIA. What was your first day on the job like there?
Yeah, the first day is it's very humbling. When you walk across the seal and you see the stars on the wall, it's overwhelming and you don't totally understand it. Obviously, over time, you very much understand it, but it still has an incredible impact on you. And you're second guessing yourself, saying, "How did I get in here?" And then you sit down. Used to have, and we still have a version of this, but it's like these 101 courses. Where you just sort of like, here's everything about the organization you need to know in like a week or 2 weeks. And you're sitting there with what's going to become your training classmates and other people who are hired right around the same time. And you're just inundated with all kinds of bureaucratic but important stuff, like here's your here's your retirement account, and this is what you can expect, and here's the organizational structure and all those things. So it's a lot of sort of indoctrination of the bureaucratic side of things early on.
So it's such a sort of normal, interesting beginning
Yeah.
to what has just become a fascinating career. Ed, I will tell you that I did a little spy work of my own before we sat down for today's conversation, and uh, somebody said to me, there are very few people I know who worked on the operations side at the agency who touched so many very significant things that have happened in the world that have been very top priorities for CIA over the years than Ed Bogan. So walk us through, to the
Yeah.
extent that you talk about some of those key moments in time when you were working for an agency that you clearly loved
Yeah.
your job, that you knew the world was changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes when I look at it, it almost defies description. And it doesn't mean I had a key role in all these things. It was just sort of, sometimes you have a key role, sometimes you're just proximate, sometimes you're in a support role. But just, starting things out, I joined the agency in summer of 2000. I, finished my training in early summer of 2001. I was selected to go to an African posting requiring French language. And on my second day of French, 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And that just changed the trajectory of everything, as obviously like the whole nation, of course, but for my organization, for the government, for my training class, suddenly there was just this incredible need to sort of reset resources. And, I had come out of training and had been selected by our then Africa division. And, within 3 weeks of 9/11, they were asked to give up quite a bit of resources, like many divisions were, human resources, to basically surge to the counterterrorism effort. So I was surged, and I would say that I kind of dug my nose in on Al Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan and didn't lift up until, 2011, 2012. It was very much, and in that time I spent, half of my time overseas, very much in the fight, and half of my time in Washington supporting those who were forward. And, the way I like to describe it is like, sort of developing my own PhD in Al Qaeda over the course of that. And as you move up the ladder into, as we like to call it, jobs of increasing, complexity and importance, you're bringing that experience with you. And, one thing we have sort of a core of operations officers who are, generalists, because we need to be able to be put anywhere and do anything, and be effective. And we have some people that really specialize in some things. And for my path, early on, I would say I definitely specialized. I will say that, I had the highest point of my life and the lowest point of my life, in that pursuit. And, obviously the highest point was, when bin Laden was killed, and the lowest point was when we had our tragedy at Coast Base. Intimately involved in all these things, along with a lot of really amazing people, amazing teams, amazing leaders, and not everyone made it. And it's a lot of chapters yet to be written, really. I mean, there's a lot that's written on it, but there's still so much to say. But yeah, so that really defined the first half of my career. And there's so many things about, sort of the contours of that pursuit, the immediate, infiltration into Afghanistan and disruption of Al Qaeda and the Taliban sort of structure. Al Qaeda fled largely into Pakistan, but also to some degree into Iran. The Al Qaeda in Pakistan were pursued aggressively in what was called the settled areas, which is the cities and the government-controlled zones of Pakistan, for years, successfully with us. And then eventually, the core Al Qaeda leadership and sort of their whole sort of body of fighters migrated to the tribal areas of Pakistan, where they had relationships that went back to the Soviet jihad days, where their leadership at least had relationships that went back. but that the government of Pakistan didn't really control. So that forced us as a government to change our tactics. That caused a lot more, challenges with our relationship with the Pakistanis, as you can imagine, because we asked them to do quite a bit. They didn't want to do, they want to do some things, they don't want to do others. There's that in and of itself, the whole relationship with Pakistan is an incredible story.
I think we could spend hours talking about the complicated nature of that
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah, and I
Particularly
hope to
with
sort of write my
dominated.
thoughts down at some point about it, because I think there's just so much. They're so rich.
Yeah. Which I just want to remind people, and I think most of our listeners already know this, but the United States did not tell Pakistan when they were flying into their airspace to go and capture and kill, which ended up killing Osama bin Laden, which kind of highlights, I think, in a really very public way, the complicated nature of
Yeah,
that relationship.
yeah,
Let me,
that's a
let me
great example.
I want to dig in on the terrorism issue, not only because you spent so much, of your career really focused on it, but we're starting, with a Cipher Brief. If you're keeping up on the open source reports that we produce daily, if you're reading the content and the interviews we're doing with true experts in terrorism, they're saying this is still a threat.
Yeah,
Yet it's getting pushed out of the headlines every day on the big networks because of other things, rightfully so,
yeah,
I
yeah.
suppose. Ukraine and Russia, which we'll talk about in a minute, with China, Taiwan. But terrorism is still a threat.
Mhm.
What concerns you the most about it right now?
Yeah, I mean, because the underlying causes, the sort of conditions that enable it, like haven't ever really been addressed, and it's autocracy, it's poverty, it's all kinds, it's education. There's so many things that bring it about, and the underlying factors just are always simmering. They're not solved, and they're not. We say that like they're simply solvable. They're not. A lot of these things are kind of chronically unsolvable, and so we have this constant threat. And of course, when you look at the landscape right now of the world, right, we have very major adversaries, and their behaviors at minimum are extremely well aligned against us right now. Who's coordinating with who?
Russia,
That's a discussion,
China,
right?
Iran, North
Right.
Korea.
Venezuela, even, like just imagine a
Right.
scenario where Venezuela actually starts crossing into Guyana tomorrow. What's that going to do, in our hemisphere? What's that going to do just to our politics? And like that's not as important as the violence that would take place. But you see what I'm saying? Like, would it be in Russia and China's interest to like poke at that and try to make that happen? Sure, why not? Because it continues to stir pots that are favorable to them. Chaos is as they say in
No.
Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder, right?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but yeah, so like you look at the world, and then you have this sort of undercurrent of the same simmering conditions that allowed for, extremism, and terrorism to sort of really blossom, unfortunately. Um, yeah, and so you still see like ISIS attacks against the Taliban, and like to some extent, you might be looking at like whatever, it's the Taliban, but like this is a thing, like this is a problem, and there's ungoverned spaces all over the world, and these groups tend to gravitate towards ungoverned spaces and then build their base and figure out how to take steps to attack us. So, yeah, I mean it's.
Are you concerned that we might be in this is kind of a very difficult question maybe for you to answer because you are retired, but are you concerned that we would ever find ourselves as a society in a situation again where a major terrorist attack in the United States
Yeah.
caught us by surprise in the way that it did with 9/11?
Yeah, not in the way it did with 9/11. I mean, anything's possible. But we've got an incredible array of people who are still looking at this issue. I mean, across the government, certainly in the agency, and I have a lot of friends who never let go of this issue. There was, I can say for myself, like sort of around 2011, 2012, I kind of moved away from the South Asia issue. I didn't move away from terrorism. I stayed for another few years looking at sort of things that came out of the Arab Spring and the sort of emergence of ISIS. But I wasn't alone. There was an army of us who just stayed on point, and I think that's really why we were as successful as we were. But a lot of those people are still like they sort of haven't left that issue. So like, we've got incredible veteran skill looking at these things. That does not mean we will not get hit, some kind of a sucker punch or something. That we can still absolutely get hit. But I do have confidence, tremendous confidence in the people that I kind of grew up with who are still doing it.
Yeah. So I want to just kind of move us forward a
Mm-hmm.
little bit.
Sure.
You kind of got, I won't say out of the counterterrorism game, because it's clear talking to you that, your mind and your heart are still
Yeah.
in that fight. But in
Yeah.
2014, Russia invaded Crimea in
Mhm.
Ukraine.
Yep.
And this kind of changed the future of your career moving
Yeah.
forward. Talk to me a little bit about what was going through your mind as that was happening, and then, how we got where we are today, where now we see Russia's full-scale invasion. We see this, crazy alignment with China,
Yep.
and we're trying to sort of figure out, where ammunition's coming from. We see alignment with North Korea. How did we get here?
Yeah. So interesting, right? Well, I'll tell you. So, sort of for me, you know, I was working in Washington in 2014 when things started really changing on the ground in Ukraine. And of course, there was a need. There was a surge requirement, and people were asking to, can people step up and support? And I was just finishing a position, and wasn't sure. I didn't have anything lined up for what was next. And I said, "This is let me go, sort of see how I can contribute here." And it turned into so much more than that. It was, there was a wide array of, unmet requirements, both in Washington and in the field related to this. There was an operating space that was far more dynamic than what we typically staffed for. Because again, now you have like a sort of, you have occupation in parts of the country. You've got the specter of Russians lurking, whether they're not just the intelligence officers, but potentially like, hunter killer teams, like looking at leadership or all that stuff. So it's a very different kind of war zone than what we sort of grew up with the Middle East war zones. So it kind of required the blending of a lot of different, basically, cultures within the agency, cultures that grew up looking, whether it was our paramilitary culture, whether it was our Eastern Europe culture, or whether it was, our, counterterrorism cadre that kind of knew how to do a range of dynamic targeting and support to, like liaisons and, liaison services who are trying to stop a range of things, whether it's going on offense, going on defense, across a range of topics. So for me, it was like, I don't want to use positive words because it's awful what happened, but it was inspiring for me to see, how hard Ukrainians were, in their services were working with their back against the wall.
This is
And
back in 2014 still, right?
yeah, like an
Yeah.
actual existential threat. Like a lot of times after 9/11, we would use the word like, hey, we've got, Al Qaeda is an existential threat. And it's not. It wasn't. It was important that we said those things. It was important that we had that posture, and that posture is what helped us be successful. But when you look at the Ukraine-Russia dynamic, it's absolutely an existential threat. And to see how hard people leaned in, the young people that I met that in their services was inspiring, and it makes you want to bring more and more. And it wasn't just for me, and many of my colleagues were inspired by the talent and the fire and the creativity. And we see that now, right? Obviously, you're watching, you can cross the Twitter sphere and you're seeing all this innovation with, FPVs and all this different UAS systems and, sensor arrays to detect, and track missiles and all these really clever things. I was seeing all that sort of early on, and many of us were too. And you're like, this is a special opportunity here, because this is crucial that Russia be stopped at minimum and then pushed back. But of course, those beg incredible policy issues. So even going back to 2014, like your posture is never what you want it to be. It's never as aggressive as you want it to be. It's never as complete, as thorough as you want it to be. But you get started, and what we do is we provide ground truth. You get all the way forward, and you get as granular as possible, and you provide that ground truth so that our policymakers can make the most informed decisions. You're not always going to like the decisions, but that's not what it's about. So you have to inform them. And, the corollary to that, and I like to say, is like you have to build relationships. And relationships is something that's very important to me. You build strong relationships because sometimes you're going to get pulled aside and someone's going to say something to you. It's like, hey, your ambassador just met with the president. This is what they discussed, but this is kind of what's going on behind the scenes, and you need to know that part too. Like, this part's bad, and then we can sort of communicate that, and it just helps complete the picture, and that way we can make better decisions. And your ambassadors are always very, very happy to complete those pictures. They're these you just this is the thing is it's life is complex, and people don't always want to be sort of straight with each other, particularly when there's very negative things to be discussed. So again, building those relationships over years, and I moved around. I was in different places of the world, serving in Africa and elsewhere in Europe, and staying engaged on the issue, because it's in part a hey, how effectively are we countering Russia, and in part it's how effectively are enabling Ukraine as a special partner because of their capabilities, and they are a special partner. I mean, they their geography, their culture, their when you look at the old Soviet Union, so much of the brain power came from there. Whether it was development of rockets or aircraft, all kinds of technology, art. I mean, it's just tremendous. It's a tremendous place, and it's under threat, and it has been for 10 years. I mean, a front solidified in 14 and 15, where these artillery was still sort of there the whole the years and years before the full scale invasion. So I mean, it was a front line. It just wasn't as active, but there were snipers for years shooting at each other, and it's
I think you know this already. The Cipher Brief learned it, when our COO, Brad Christian, and I made the first trip to Ukraine about a year after the full-scale invasion. And as we were interviewing Ukrainians and members of government, they would say this war didn't just begin. It began in 2014. And it was a little bit of a, for people who haven't followed what's been happening in Ukraine very closely, a little bit of a history lesson. So I wonder, I mean, when you fast forward to where we are now and you look at what Russia is doing there, it is astonishing to think that nobody really had a clue that we were headed in this direction back in 2014. The Ukrainians would have said they had a clue.
Right.
But I wonder, I mean, we see the threat that Russia now poses. If you were able to, through some magic time machine, go back to 2014, Ed Bogan, and be like, hey, I've got one bit of intel for you.
Yeah.
What would you tell yourself back then?
Oof. That's a great question. I mean, understanding, I think understanding and combating Russian mis and disinformation, going as far back, if not farther than that, is about one of the most important things, because they have had a global campaign, and it's global. It's not just against our allies and our coalitions. It's against our adversaries to deepen their adversarialness. It's against those in between, non-aligned countries, just sort of those who want to stay out of it, so to speak. And what it does, and there's a really tremendous piece in the Institute for the Study of War from 27 March. I talked about this piece a lot. It talks about how Russia's sort of narrative dominance, my words for it, narrative dominance, kind of boxes in our decision making, and it creates the conditions left, the sort of the four corners of our decision making that are beneficial to Russia, and they're not real. They're not really our four corners, and that's like we're constantly sort of like misunderstanding their capabilities and their intentions. We're constantly sort of underdeveloping our own risk calculus. We're our international obligations are definitely under assault, and at a micro level, at a granular level, our society is always under assault from this as well, to sort of keep us fractured, attacking ourselves.
Threat.
Yeah. So it goes after our very own cohesion, right, as a country, and our coherence, as a country that is a beacon. This campaign is the thing, I think, that we have to wake up and counter this thing, and there's ways to counter it, and it's through it's through very clear policy objectives that are very clearly stated and that are backed up by actions and that are moved against in a timely manner. I say this to lots of people. When I'm thinking about a crisis, and this issue is a crisis, not just, it's obviously a crisis for Ukraine, but this whole sort of what Russia is doing globally is like you have to understand some principles that sort of focus your thoughts when you're making decisions about how to prioritize your actions. So like time matters. The risks of inaction. Well, the other thing is don't self-limit. And then the third thing is the risks of inaction are always, worse than you could possibly calculate. And they're all kind of interconnected, and it's all about urgency. But you have to recognize those things, and you have to make timely decisions. And you see with our policy, a lot of times it feels like it's, I hate to say it like this, but I'm just going to say it like multiple days late, multiple dollars short on so many issues. We come around to the right decision. We come around very late. And what happens is we're making...
It's like the history of America.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Right? It is truly the history of America. If you look at how long it took the United States to get involved in World War II, for example. It's
so true. Suzanne, it's so true. And what happens though in the space where we're moving in a piecemeal manner is we get the worst of both worlds. What we get is, if we do this, if we stay on a piecemeal course, Ukraine won't succeed. And Ukraine will win if we support them properly. But if we go on a piecemeal course, they will lose, and then we will have to fight Russia.
Yeah.
Right? So like
Europe's certainly waking up to that reality.
Europe's certainly waking up to that reality. And I think, when you guys were very kind to invite me out to your second trip out, and I was very thankful to be there. And, that was at a time when it was unsure if our, supplemental package was going to go through. And indeed, it was like, kind of thought it wasn't. And what you're seeing was, Ukrainians and sort of like the eastern flank, so to speak, are like, hey, we may have to do this ourselves. Like this is what we don't want, but we don't have a choice. Like
that's the reality.
Right?
I think just for folks who are listening, you're referring to the Cipher Brief second annual Kyiv Economic and Security Forum that was just held in April in Kyiv, and the idea being that the Cipher Brief brings over folks in the private sector with deep expertise in sort of the technologies and the things that Ukraine really needs right now for conversations around how this war could be fought. And you're absolutely right. There was so much uncertainty. There was almost bitterness brewing amongst some of the Ukrainians that we talked to, which was so deeply understandable.
Yes.
Given the situation they were in, given, the promises and no delivery. I think the gut punch for me, and I've mentioned this before, was, when the team went to the train station in the evening and it's dark to get on the train to leave, because that's the only way you can get in and out, either by train or car. And you saw 20 ambulances lined up waiting to take, the bodies of the dead and the wounded every single day. And you think about every day that the U.S. is delaying because of politics or whatever, getting that aid to Ukraine. It was really humbling, disturbing, upsetting. I just wonder, this isn't really something that America can afford to take its eye off of. And I wonder if you can kind of put, with your deep experience in the region, with your deep experience on Russia, if you can put this into perspective for us on why should we care? Because Russia's flooding us with disinformation that says, focus on what's happening at home. The United States can only do one thing at a time. Right. You can't focus on international issues. Right. Don't you worry about what's going on over there. Right. Why is that wrong? And what should we be doing to educate people about the risks that are very real internationally?
I think, again, I'm going to sort of paraphrase that Institute piece, but if Russia can isolate us out of this fight through narrative dominance, narrative obfuscation, mis and disinformation, that's its only path to victory. And then what it wants to do is isolate Ukraine. It's corrupt. It's Nazis. It's not a real country. All the things, all the narratives out there that can...
They don't have to be true.
Nope. And
we just have to believe them.
You just have to pick one and say, oh, that kind of rings true for me. They isolate us, isolate the West, then they can defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. At that point, they can turn to other areas of interest Baltics, whatever. And even if you're a skeptic and you say like they're not going to come across into NATO space, that would just be absurd. There is no scenario with a Ukrainian defeat where Russia doesn't take the opportunity to project like they're going to. It's almost going to have the same effect from a resource standpoint and a funding standpoint, which seems to be how we make our decisions. Mm-hmm. It'll be the same cost without cost of blood, unless it does turn into a shooting war, which I think it would.
Yeah. Well, like I said, just look at Europe right now,
right?
And how they have dramatically come together, and how they're more united in understanding the threat now than they ever have been.
Right.
I do think the threat has changed. Either we weren't paying attention, or it changed dramatically.
Right.
And they're on the front lines of it, really.
Yeah.
So, Ed, I really want to hear what you're doing now, kind of in your private sector role.
Yeah.
Or, as I mentioned right off the top, we're super pleased that you're a new Cipher Brief expert and working with us on understanding, a lot of the reporting that we do, understanding what this means and bringing context around it. But you're starting up a 501c3.
Yeah.
Tell me what it is and why you're doing it.
Sure. Thank you. It's so, I don't know if I should call it an academic institute or a think tank or both. What it is so I have, my interests and sort of areas of study before I joined the agency was not just law, but also kind of continental philosophy. Super interested in a couple different, sort of thinkers that have spent a lot of time looking at, this is a notion called state of exception. What it really is in constitutions have clauses about what to do in an emergency, where you can suspend rule of law or sort of have an balance of powers. And what happens with wannabe autocrats is they often take real emergencies and extend their power or fabricate an emergency to create power and then sort of don't let go of it. And you see that around the world right now, and there's plenty of historical examples. And what there isn't, there's a lot of good scholarship on it, but what there isn't is sort of a central repository. So I want to create that repository. So it's going to be online, and ideally, if it's successful, there'll be conferences, and I also envision sort of podcasts where you can bring together an academic and a policy practitioner, and let's talk about something that Erdogan did in 2017 or something like that, and just sort of analyze and say, okay, was this a proper use of a state of emergency, or was there some misuse there? Because it's so commonly used in the 20th and 21st centuries, I think this is an interesting issue. It's very niche, very narrow, but it's what it does is it ties a bunch of things together for me. My sort of philosophical interests, my legal background, because it's kind of a constitutional issue, although it doesn't require democracies that don't have constitutions, like in Israel, can still have an issue. Like if there's legislation meant to diminish the power of the Supreme Court, that creates a de facto imbalance. That's something that should be discussed, right? So I'm trying to set up a global center for discussing this issue.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. It's funny. I was just sitting with my kids the other night talking about how much history repeats itself, and if you don't understand history, you get suckered in every single
100%.
time.
100%.
Yeah, and we're seeing it now. And if you don't understand disinformation, you're going to get suckered in every single time as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ed Bogan, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you during the podcast today. I hope that people will tune into the Cipher Brief to hear more of your insights and kind of how we should be thinking about what's going on right now, particularly in Russia, Ukraine, but also with the fight against terrorism. I don't know if there are any limits to. You're kind of an overachiever. I don't know if anyone's ever told you that before. But I really appreciate you kind of sharing your insights on the world and some of the experiences that you've had over your career with us. And thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you so much. Pleasure's all mine. I really appreciate you. Appreciate the Cipher Brief, and thank you to you. Thank you to Brad for having me.